I wanted to welcome everybody to the webinar that is hosted by the Refrigerant Emissions Elimination Forum, REEF. I must say, I always find it inspiring and really exciting to see such a strong amount of interest and turnout for conversations like we're having today. And obviously the conversation or today's topic around how California's Senate Bill 1206 and other initiatives that are being led at the state level are looking to advance refrigerant recovery and reclamation efforts. For the benefit of everyone, including myself, since I was having a few moments of technical difficulty at the start, we are actually already recording this webinar, and I've been made aware that there's going to be both English and Spanish transcriptions available, which is wonderful. And obviously, we will ensure that the presentation is made available on REEF's website after the session is over. So let's get started. My name's Zoe Dawson. I'm absolutely honored and thrilled to serve on REEF's board of directors and to serve as your host of today's webinar. It is featuring an outstanding and far more superior panel than myself. It includes Richie Kaur of NRDC, Mark Armstrong of AGAS, and Anastasia O'Rourke of the Carbon Containment Lab. Together, I'm going to be helping to moderate lots of great questions, I hope, from our audience with these experts as they help to walk us through an overview of the current policy landscape as it's the national and the leading state level relative to refrigerant management activities. Obviously, the specific critical role that reclaimers play in advancing these efforts, and an overview of what private sector leaders are doing and those early adopters of sustainable procurement and buyers principles that are really helping to elevate the importance of reclaimed refrigerants underneath corporate ESG and circular economy strategies. So lots of great information that we're going to be diving into. My ultimate hope and wish and goal of today's session is that we are first and foremost connecting you with these champions and leaders in their fields and helping to provide you with some really important and invaluable insights around how you and other key actors can look to advance refrigerant recovery and reclamation efforts yourself, and singularly to help inspire you to take action. So keep that in mind as we move forward. To ensure we are all in the same place, because I always like to level set. Not everybody knows why we care so much about refrigerants or why REEF cares, but hopefully this isn't news to anybody. Refrigerants, for those of you who are logging in because refrigerants was the hashtag that caught your eye on the LinkedIn post, we know they are the fastest growing greenhouse gas globally, with many of those refrigerants having global warming potential many thousands of times greater than CO2. They're also everywhere. I often refer to them as the miracles of modern life. They keep our food cold, they keep our ice cream from melting, they keep our homes and our offices nice and comfortable and warm in the winter and cool in the summer. But they also leak from those equipment as well, and that those leaked emissions what create the outsized short-term environmental impact and challenge that we seek to address. And unfortunately, we also know that this challenge is just simply going to intensify as we accelerate the extremely necessary adoption of heat pump technology to help electrify our heating systems in homes and buildings. And we're just faced by this unfortunate trade-off in our current environment where when we're procuring equipment as end users, we have to make a choice between efficiency, electrification, and the GWP, the environmental impact of those refrigerants. Well, at REEF, we actually believe that that trade-off isn't necessary. And as a nonprofit collaborative organization, we're dedicated to try and address the lack of solutions that are currently available to eliminate the most climate adverse refrigerants and to help reduce refrigerant emissions relative to HVAC equipment that is currently in use. So our goal throughout is to help bridge gaps between electrification and decarbonization. We do that in a couple of ways. We actively seek, as we are today, by uniting industry voices to address challenges around equipment leaks, lifecycle refrigerant management. We'll dig more into that today. And to also help drive the demand to accelerate the transition to market adoption of ultra-low GWP technologies and their availability for end users to purchase. Ultimately, we envision a world where refrigerants will have a zero impact. And our mission, as always, is to be stubbornly optimistic and through that to inspire action by aggregating all of you who we work with to amplify the voice of the end user around solutions and opportunities for the end user. So collective demand, these things that we look to do by bringing stakeholders like you together, including corporate sustainability practitioners. I know that there's a bunch of owner operators, there's other NGOs and advocates on this call as well, other technology leaders. We aim to bring you together so we can collectively help to accelerate progress towards this future, regardless of what is happening in the marketplace, regardless of what is happening on the political space. We seek to really do this and help to bring education and awareness to others so that they can equally be empowered to take action. And this peer learning experience, this webinar today, is just one example of the types of activities and events that REEF supports. And we hope that you will use it as an opportunity to engage with us on the urgency of addressing refrigerants and to do something today. So before we get started with that wonderful note, I always love to jump back into a few quick housekeeping notes, because as your host and moderator, I want to make sure that everybody understands how to engage effectively. For those of you who are new to the Google Meet platform, you've probably already figured out that you are muted as an audience member, but that does not mean we do not want to hear from you. As this slide shows, there is a little feature in the bottom right-hand corner of your Google Meet screen. And if you click on that, it'll open up a Q&A feature. We are going to be holding questions until the end of today's webinar session. So please, whenever you're submitting a question, please indicate if you have a question for one of the speakers directly, or if it's a question that's really meant for a general collective response. Our goal is to make sure that we give as much time as we can to our speakers, and then to leave a nice period of collaborative discussion opportunity at the end of the webinar so that we can stay on schedule. So with that, keeping ourselves on schedule and myself from talking too long, I'm going to be passing over the virtual microphone to Richie Kaur, who I am thrilled to introduce. She's a senior super pollutant reduction advocate at NRDC. I have to say she has been and continues to be one of the most influential champions of climate policies at the national and state level that I know. And Richie is going to help set the stage for today's discussion with an overview of national refrigerant management policy efforts, and just helping to emphasize for all of this the importance of refrigerant recovery, reuse, and reclamation. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Richie. And again, please pop your questions in the chat, and we'll address those at the end.
Thank you, Zoe. I should have stayed off camera while you were saying all those nice things about me, because it's very hard to not react when somebody's that kind to you. But thank you for all of that. Good afternoon, everyone who's in the US, but not in Alaska or Hawaii. Good morning to them. My goal today, I'm one of 3 speakers, is to lay out the refrigerant management policy landscape. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the background. I think Zoe did a great job of setting the stage. But I always like to begin any presentation with a little bit of level set, should there be listeners in this group who are new to this topic and will benefit from hearing a little bit more about it. So without further ado, let's dive into the climate imperative of refrigerant management. This is a slide we'll leave up for 2 seconds. This tells you what NRDC is, or the Natural Resources Defense Council is. I'm assuming that everybody's going to get the slide deck so people can read this at leisure. So we can move on. Refrigerant management, next slide. Really, as Zoe pointed out, refrigerants are heat transfer fluids that are used for cooling or producing cooling or heating effects. Most of the refrigerants used today are hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs, that were used to replace ozone-depleting substances in the past, but are highly potent greenhouse gases themselves and are under a global phase down. The biggest takeaway from this background slide that I want you to have is that there are 2 ways to minimize refrigerant climate impacts. One is life cycle refrigerant management, which is minimizing the releases of refrigerants from existing pieces of equipment and products that hold them, and maximizing recovery, recycling, reclamation, and reuse of those refrigerants. This is also sometimes referred to as bank management. And then the second tool in the toolkit is switching to alternative refrigerants when the existing equipment comes to end of life. If possible, we move away to technology that uses low or ultra-low global warming potential, or GWP, alternative refrigerants in that new equipment. Both of these work hand in hand and in tandem minimize climate impacts, but are also beneficial for other goals that we have to meet, and beneficial for the economy because it minimizes some of the costs associated with losing refrigerants and costs associated with producing new refrigerants. Next slide. So just from an emission standpoint, because this is a science-based policy talk, let's talk about the science first, what the global HFC emissions outlook looks like. The graph on the left is a plot from the 2022 ozone assessment from NOAA that shows you the outlook for HFC emissions globally from 2000 until 2050. And it also shows you the relative contributions of the sectors that use HFCs to those emissions. If you look at the legend and you add all of the sectors up that use HFCs as refrigerants, that's nearly 90%, which is why the bank of HFCs is really a refrigerant bank, and we're talking about refrigerant management today. And broadly, thanks to the Montreal Protocol, global HFC emissions will decline because we are under a production and consumption phase down. As you can see that it peaks, it's still growing now, but it peaks somewhere in the 2030s and then it'll come down. But that decline will not be as fast as the production consumption phase down schedule because these banks last for a long time. All of these pieces of equipment like air conditioners, refrigeration systems, they last for decades. So once a refrigerant gets installed inside a piece of equipment and is put out there, it can last anywhere from 20 to 40 years, depending on the average lifetime of that equipment. And as Zoe mentioned, and I like to sometimes joke, refrigerants are in everything, everywhere, all at once. And we have to be aware that the mindful management of these substances is critical. Next slide. Now, the need for refrigerants on the whole is growing for good reasons, but growing. So if you look at the graph on the left, that's the global projections for the increase in air conditioning stock in the world out to 2050. As the planet warms up and access to cooling improves, billions more room air conditioners are expected to be installed in 2050. This is certainly true in areas that experience hot ambient temperatures in the global south, but it also is happening in the United States. Places that never needed air conditioning before are now needing to install them. Then on the right is a plot that shows you the increase in heat pump capacity by 2030. And that is also expected to jump manifold as we decarbonize our built environment, electrify the buildings, and adopt heat pumps. Every single heat pump uses refrigerant as the heat transfer fluid. And so that also increases the need for refrigerants. So really to harmonize these goals of phasing down HFCs, but phasing up access to cooling and building decarbonization and heat pump adoption, we have to use those two solutions that are good for the environment, which is maximize recovery, recycling, reclamation, reuse, minimize leaks, and also switch to better alternatives when possible. And then you get perfect harmony among these three big goals. Next slide. With that, let's take a brief look at the benefits, the quantified benefits, and a brief description of the unquantified benefits. So now lifecycle refrigerant management has really shot into the big time. So there was recently a report published by the United Nations on LRM, or lifecycle refrigerant management, earlier this year. And it has quantified the ozone and climate benefits from minimizing leaks coming from equipment and recovering refrigerant at end of life and reusing it. So between 2025 and 2050, just from a climate standpoint, we stand to avoid up to 50 or 40, nearly 40 gigatons of CO2 equivalents of emissions. And that is a staggering number, and that's overlapping with the benefits we get from Kigali, because some LRM measures were already in place in certain countries. But if every country did a good job of it, we could avoid a staggering amount of GHG emissions. And as big as the 40 gigaton number is, it's still an underestimate because it doesn't quantify certain other benefits, which are first and foremost energy efficiency improvement. You can have any SEER rating on a piece of equipment on an AC that you buy, but it's not going to function at that level unless your equipment is leak tight. Then we know that certain refrigerants, certain fluorinated refrigerants in the current generation and the next generation fall under the international definition of PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. So reducing emissions also leads to reduction in PFAS emissions. Some refrigerants are volatile organic compounds. When they're emitted, they lead to formation of photochemical smog. And so just keeping the refrigerants managed well and inside the equipment and recovering them when we no longer need the equipment is good from preventing those types of emissions as well. We know certain next generation refrigerants are going to be mildly flammable, and we need our workforce trained on handling that safely. When you train a workforce on LRM, you're also training them on safe handling practices. So that's another added benefit. And finally, every molecule that we have already produced of an HFC that we can reuse is better than a molecule that we'll have to newly produce, because the process of production of fluorinated refrigerants or HFCs is very resource and energy intensive. So we have circular economy benefits that are derived from life cycle refrigerant management. Let's move on. So this is a slide I like to show because it really optically captures how important banks are. And this was a slide made by the California Air Resources Board. It's in their 2022 scoping plan. And it shows the context of annual HFC emissions versus annual greenhouse gas emissions in the state. So the smallest bar on the left is the annual HFC emissions. The biggest bar on the right are the annual total greenhouse gas emissions. And this is true for states at the national level and at the global level. HFC emissions annually make up 2 to 3% of total greenhouse gas emissions, which is why sometimes people think of, are we solving a 3% problem? Really not, because when you look at the bank in the middle, that bar shows you just how much, just the scale of GHGs that are sitting inside these pieces of equipment. So really it's a ticking bomb that's slowly leaking GHGs. And the report says if released spontaneously, the existing HFC bank would equal 60% of annual statewide GHG emissions in California. So just extrapolate that globally. It's a staggering number just coming from one sector. And that's why this is important from an environmental standpoint. Next slide. So with that, I'll move on to policies. And I will first start with a timeline. I'm not going to walk all the way through. This is something to digest when you have the slides. But really, broadly speaking, before 2014, action on refrigerants was largely focused on ozone-depleting substances. There was some early action in California, and this is just action in the US, I mean. But really, HFCs came into focus with the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol when, in 2016, countries agreed to a global phase down of HFCs. Unfortunately, domestically, that was followed by a period where there were HFC rules adopted at the federal level, but then rolled back due to legal challenges. But then that led to state action really taking off, with California followed by several Climate Alliance states adopting the vacated federal rules, but then continuing to move forward because several of these states have their own climate targets, have their own mid-century climate and carbon neutrality targets that they have to meet, and they're counting on federal action to meet those targets. But if that doesn't happen, they have to keep moving on. Fortunately, we got the AIM Act in 2020, which domestically gives EPA the authority to enact a phase down of HFCs and implement certain other measures to make the phase down smooth. We'll get into that a little bit on the next slide. But that started a slew of actions at the federal level. We've had several different rules coming under the AIM Act, one very recently. But state action continued as well. California went beyond just adopting the vacated rules. They adopted a new regulation, the first GWP limits in the nation, and the first reclaim use requirements in the country, which is the focus of the conversation today. But over the last 3 years, there's continued to be state action. Washington has adopted a new law and implemented that via regulation. New York has proposed HFC rule amendments, and California has also adopted SB 1206. And we'll touch on SB 1206 in a minute. So next slide. First, let's just take a brief look at the AIM Act. The EPA has sometimes referred to this as the three-legged stool. The first leg on the left is the HFC production consumption phase down. The schedule mirrors the phase down schedule of the Kigali Amendment and reduces really supply of virgin new HFCs by 85% over 15 years. The other two legs are technology transitions by sector that is moving to lower GWP, more climate-friendly alternatives. And then the third leg is managing use and reuse. These two are the same two solutions we saw in the beginning, which are getting to alternative refrigerants when possible and managing the refrigerants in every piece of equipment. Well, the EPA did finalize a rule recently on that third leg, establishing leak detection repair requirements, and for refrigerants using reclaimed refrigerants, reclaimed HFCs to service in 3 sectors. There's additional requirements for fire suppressant and so on, but I won't get into that. But really, it's this complementary reduction of supply and demand that keeps the phase down smooth and buffets the economy from volatility and market upheavals like sudden refrigerant price hikes, sudden shortages, and really bolsters our ability to transition in a sustainable manner while meeting all the other goals of building decarbonization and so on. Next, this is really the heart of the discussion, which is California is leading the way when it comes to refrigerant reclaim reuse requirements. The first of them, as I mentioned, came in 2020 via regulation, where they had the first national program to use that required the use of reclaimed HFCs by AC manufacturers, either in new equipment or for servicing. This is a time-limited program, but it's been very successful. And then they also established the reclamation standard. They didn't call it that in the regulation, but they established for the first time a virgin content limit in reclaimed refrigerants, because right now there's a glut of stockpile of virgin refrigerants in the country. We don't want that getting relabeled as reclaimed because that's greenwashing. And so this was a critical loophole that California closed and was recently adopted by EPA as the national HFC reclamation standard under the AIM Act. And then came the law, Senate Bill 1206 in 2022, which in and of itself is a 3-legged stool. It has 3 key principles, which cover both of those elements of refrigerant management and alternative refrigerants, but also bakes in a third very important element, which is state procurement policy. Again, using the power of the purse to move the needle. So the first one is there's prohibitions on bulk virgin HFCs above certain GWP thresholds that will ratchet down with time. And end users can either use reclaimed HFCs or move away from those substances altogether. And starting in 2025, this will mostly affect the large commercial industrial refrigeration type equipment. By 2033, nearly all refrigeration AC heat pump equipment in the state will either have to be below the 750 GWP limit or use reclaimed refrigerants. The procurement policy angle is the state will lead by example. They will do it first, starting next year. Use reclaimed HFCs only if it's above 750 for all types of equipment that the state is using. And often, governments are the largest landlords. And so it's incredibly important for state procurement policy to have this kind of a requirement because it really establishes that market demand for greater refrigerant recovery and reuse. And in the long term, the state has to transition away from HFCs, and CARB is required to publish an assessment in 2025, specifying how they will do that, particularly through the adoption of new low and ultra-low GWP alternative refrigerants, which California has defined by law as less than 150 being low and less than 10 GWP as being ultra-low. Next slide. So this has become a precursor to a lot of policy that's now coming down the pike. The New York State Department of Environmental Conservation has recently proposed amendments to their HFC rule, which aligns with many of the requirements in SB 1206. That final rule is awaited. It's not out yet. But other states are also interested in SB 1206 because it has all the necessary ingredients of minimizing refrigerant emissions. Too early to say what's happening, but it's happening. And this interest is likely only to increase further if federal rules are legally challenged. And one thing everybody's eagerly awaiting is CARB's assessment. This is government, policymakers, civil society like us. Everybody's looking forward to this. Next slide. I just want to end on this note. Regulations are important policy drivers. They're important market drivers, but they're not the only market drivers by any stretch. There's 2 more that I want to highlight and really tee up the discussion that comes after me. One is the other type of policy, the carrot end of the carrot and stick analogy, which is incentive programs. when incentives are correctly designed and rightly placed, they can enhance the adoption of the best available near zero emission technologies and promote circular economy. So that's incredibly important, even though we've not had the time to dive into that today. And then the last one moves beyond policy, which is corporate citizenship commitments. For any kind of market transformation to occur, it has mostly been driven in the past by industry leaders who are willing to take a chance on sustainable cutting-edge technologies that don't yet have too many takers. And this is where companies that lead the charge and include refrigerants as an important part of their emissions planning is incredibly important, part of your scope 1, 2, 3 planning, but also coming together and making commitments on finding the best solutions to cut down your emissions and lead by example in the corporate world. So with that, I will thank you all for listening and pass things back to Zoe for questions.
Richie, that was absolutely amazing. And I'm going to apologize for everybody that joined in after I'd gone through my housekeeping. We are holding questions until the end, but you provided such a rich overview, and I have written down things I want to follow up with you on, but I'm going to hold my breath and I'm going to jump in to introduce Mike Armstrong now, who's president of AGAS Americas, because I think what you've set up and framed out, Richie, is a perfect segue for Mike to start introducing, how AGAS, is one of the largest reclaimers of refrigerants in the US, has been really helping to foster some of this collaboration and industry stakeholder relationships to help drive active recovery and use of reclaimed refrigerants. And also to really help articulate, the points that you were making about what the compelling economic case is for using reclaims. So without further ado, Mike, I'm going to hand it over to you because I know that you've got some amazingly valuable insights from your work across the US and most specifically within California as well. And I want to hand things over so that you can give us all of the great information, and we'll follow up with you questions afterwards as well.
Well, thanks very much, Zoe, and Richie. Thanks for the nice lead-in with a number of key items there. I'll talk to a few of those. I'm going to bring this to you from the perspective of an operator, right? So AGAS is, as Zoe mentioned, one of the largest reclaimers in the United States. It's also one of the largest companies who's singularly focused on refrigerant recovery. And if we go to the next slide, I'll kind of walk you through the state of the industry in the United States. Reclaim in and of itself is valuable. In fact, by definition, you are recovering a pound of product that you're then reclaiming. And so when we talk about why reclaim is important, reclaim is the end result of a pound of refrigerant being recovered in the first place. And that is the crown jewel. If we think about refrigerant management in the United States and around the world, it's working with the market to develop a marketplace where the gas can be recovered safely and bring it back to a reclaimer. And there's fantastic reclaimers in the United States. And do the right thing with the product, whether that's reclaiming it to the proper standard, or in some cases destroying that. But it's not to ever vent the product intentionally in the atmosphere. That's how we get into big problems. The benefit of reclaim in the US, similar to what we saw with R22 in the last decade, will be very similar in this decade, in the decade ahead of us. And that is that it's the bridge. Richie talked about, the phase down. The difference is there's a phase down of HFCs, whereas with R22, we had a phase out of the product. And so we will see at this point, perpetual use at a much lower level of product for the long term. And that helps owners extend the useful life of their equipment. People who run companies, people who own homes, put a lot of money into their comfort cooling systems. And reclaim has been a very successful bridge to ensure that that product can run for the full useful life of the equipment. It also ensures that we have, less reliance on international refrigerant supply. So in the United States, greater than 70% of the refrigerant in the country actually comes from outside of the country. And so starting to build a robust reclaim program creates what you could call an American-made product. But similar to our focus on energy independence in the country, there's also a focus on refrigerant independence, and Reclaim United States helps provide a valuable tool towards that. Reclaim also provides, nice compliance with federal and local regulatory requirements. Richie talked about the federal level. I'll talk about a very successful start of the California R4 program. High quality reclaimers will help you your organization or your governments, in fact, have high integrity programs that are compliant with the required regulations. And then one thing that's changed, and I think a lot of the states are adopting this as well, between California and some of the federal programs, is starting to define that product to ensure that reclaim isn't being really passed off as a counterfeit virgin product. I mean, there's no real value in working on reclaim if it's really virgin. And I think the regulation is highly supportive of that as the programs move forward. So if we go to the next couple slides, I'll talk to those quickly because I think some of it's been covered potentially. We can advance to the next slide. So reclaim is on the rise, right? So HFC reclaim in particular has had a very strong growth trajectory over the last couple years. People should expect to see that increase as the AIM Act continues and develops. But more importantly, as states develop their own programs as well, this will drive what you're going to see is a very strong renaissance in the United States. 2024 is Mike Armstrong's number. That's not really a published number quite yet, but if I look at our own business and I look at some of our colleagues in the industry, I think you're going to see very strong growth in 2024 as industry moves to support the federal programs, and Section H is out to define some of that, but also some of the state level programs that are advancing. The key thing is reclaim is available, right? If you're planning that as an organization or a business and you're connecting with reclaimers, and I'll talk a bit more of that in a couple of slides, there is no shortage of reclaim in the current marketplace as these programs start to roll out. Let's go to the next slide. We'll go quickly through this one. I mean, Richie had it in one of her slides as well. So key thing for the AIM Act is it's not a phase out of production. So there will be HFCs available for the long term, subject always to future rulemaking. But the intent from the EPA and the AIM Act is to ensure that Americans have access to continued supply of products, and a lot of the lower GWP products will contain HFC components. These will be necessary to support the production of those materials as well. Let's go to the next slide. This is an important slide because at the federal level, we're going to have a change in administration, right? And so we've passed Section H. At the same time, if there's a sense that that there'll be some step backs in some of these programs, not that we're sure of that, but potentially these are the states that are going to fill the gaps, right? This is the Climate Alliance. This represents 55 to 60% of industry and population. You have stalwarts who have already leaned pretty far forward, like California and New York and probably Washington doing some things as well. These will be the states that are the backdrops, right? You think about refrigerant management, very progressive, very strong support from industry, and they should be really good examples. I think if there was a case study of how to pull this off the right way, California did a great job with R4. Industry was a big part of that. Reclaimers were a big part of that. I can't think of a single customer who was not able to find the products they needed when they needed them to support the programs. And we should look at that as a program that was ambitious, but also very successful. And that's just speaking from the voice of a reclaimer, staying close to clients who supported the program. Okay, let's go to the next slide. There's only a couple left here. So I think one of the important things that I thought was valuable to talk about is, how to future-proof your HFC strategy, whether you're a state government, whether you're a reclaimer, whether you're a company who needs access to these products. The important part is to get into the program early and do your homework. Know your assets, know the equipment inside your businesses that you want to work through the end of their useful life. Reach out to a reclaimer. A reclaimer is relatively agnostic when it comes to the technology you're using, or the gas you want to use. A reclaimer is going to give you lots of different solutions, from their own capabilities, from the marketplace's capabilities. They will help give you, they're not necessarily to sell equipment or to pitch a certain gas, but they'll give you lots of options as you go through these programs. And for a lot of these programs, they will keep you compliant because reclaimers have a pretty high threshold when it comes to compliance with federal programs, from a marketplace standpoint. And then work together with that reclaimer to figure out what's your inventory of equipment you want to serve, what's the capability of that specific reclaimer. There's lots of incredible reclaimers in the country, right? So there's probably 10 or 12 that are, really top tier that can support you, regionally, nationally, to pull this off. And start to talk about how you secure your supply. I mean, if there's one thing that we've seen in the past, it's not necessarily that people don't have good plans, it's that they start the plans too late. And this is something that there's a pretty nice framework that the government lays out, California lays out, different states will lay out. Think about that plan to succeed, and work on getting that supply done. But get ahead of the game. As I tell people, like, if you are proactive and you develop a plan and you engage really good, strong, trusted reclaimers, this is the best reclaim market in the world here in the United States. I think you're really on track for fulfilling your requirements, or giving you options to phase down the different gases you have in your facilities. And I think we just have one more slide, which is a question that comes up often. So I thought I would sort of answer it. And so there's two different words that are important in the industry, and that is reclaimed refrigerant and recycled refrigerant. And so the question that obviously comes out is the product going to work as well as a virgin product? At the end of the day, virgin product and reclaimed product, they both have to meet the same standard. And these are standards that are developed by equipment manufacturers. They're standards that are developed and supported by the AHRI. So it's an industry approved standard. It's generally 99.5% pure. That level of purity is going to work perfectly fine in your system. I'll contrast that with recycled refrigerant. And that's a refrigerant that you can pull out of a system, but not necessarily take through the full cleaning process. It might have moisture in it. It might have contaminants in it. And so you can put that back into your system, but there's just an operational risk of putting contaminants that weren't intended. So that's the fundamental difference when you think about the products. We always recommend people to reclaim the product, certainly depending on the criticality of the system, ensure your system's protected, to give you confidence of good end of life for your equipment, and to make sure that it's cleaned and doesn't damage your valuable assets. And the key thing is you develop relationships with reclaimers is, a good reclaimer is going to stand behind the product warranty. So make sure as you find opportunities to purchase reclaimed product, that you're not forgetting about good warranty language to make sure if there is ever a problem, a good reclaimer will always stand behind their product. So the last thing, you're seeing a lot of this in the marketplace, this focus on certified reclaimed refrigerant. This is working in a number of states. This will support the new federal programs coming out as well. So think about these three things, right? Is your reclaimer working? Do they have an AHRI 700 lab, or do they have access to one to give you the right testing certifications? There's an ISO cert as well you can get. Is the product you're getting at least 85% reclaim? That's an important part of the program as we define what reclaim looks like going forward. And you want to make sure the product's pure, right? You want to make sure that product is at least 99.5%. That will give you good life in your equipment to make sure that the assets you have and the programs you run are effective at the end of the day. And look, reclaimers are your partner. This isn't really a pitch for AGAS. This is a pitch for the industry, right? So this is a small but mighty industry. Reclaimers are generally small businesses, so we like supporting small businesses. But there's a great marketplace out here to support people. Please plan ahead from a business standpoint. AGAS certainly happy to help you around the country on recovery and reclaim needs. But we certainly appreciate the opportunity to talk about the industry, to talk about how we think we're an important bridge, but a valuable partner in the environmental journey for lots of stakeholders. Thanks, Zoe.
That was great, Mike. Thank you so much. It's where the rubber hits the road, really. We talk about these amazing policies that have been put in place that, Richie introduced, and I think that's just such an amazing transition in how we ensure that we have the right critical actors throughout the supply chain to ensure that that reclaimed refrigerant gets to those end users. So without further ado, I feel like cheeky saying I'm leaving the best till last, Anastasia, but I'm going to say it anyway because you have been very patient, and I'm thrilled to introduce you. to this panel, and obviously to help wrap up our presentation today around advancing use of reclaimed refrigerants. For those of you who have not crossed paths with Anastasia before, she's a Senior Managing Director at the Carbon Containment Lab and is a internationally renowned, I would hesitate to say, sustainability expert. So I'm really happy to have her. We're here with us today to help wrap up today's conversations and to really share with us her extensive knowledge on life cycle refrigerant management strategies for the private sector specifically. So kind of picking up that thread that Mike left with us of, like get ahead of the game, start early, start, inventorying your assets and understanding what you need to do. There's a tremendous amount of work that the private sector can do to drive down their emissions through proactive engagement on managing their refrigerants, and Anastasia has been one of their key partners and cheerleaders along the way, and has got oodles of experience as well as of examples of leading companies that have made reclamation a core strategy in tackling refrigerant related GHG emissions and supporting overall ESG compliance. So Anastasia, thank you so much for your patience. I'm going to hand it over to you and I'll pop you into the next slide.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. It's a real honor to be here and a pleasure. Thank you, REEF and Zoe and the whole team for inviting me to share a few thoughts here. I'm here in New Haven, Connecticut, working with this group called the Carbon Containment Lab. What I'd like to do is I'll give you a little overview of where we're coming from and why we have something to say about refrigerants, why we're excited about them, in a weird way, because they're, a little bit invisible to the rest of the world as a climate solution, but we think that's about to change. We think it's on the cusp of becoming the next methane in the climate world, and we think it's important to get on with it. And there's a lot of very practical things that you can all do in companies or large organizations, even small ones. So it's a very tangible project in terms of climate action. So that's why we're excited about it. I'll then talk about some companies, give you a few examples, some of the benefits that people are seeing from acting early on this topic and getting ahead of it, and then wrap up with just a couple of thoughts on procurement and purchasing in particular as a key function that often interfaces with this topic. I know that's near and dear to REEF's heart, so just wanted to share some thoughts on that. So if you could go to the next slide, thanks. Just briefly about our lab. So we recently spun out of Yale University. We are looking at all sorts of different emergent climate solutions and trying to apply both scientific knowledge as well as sort of scientific and investment expertise to looking at all these climate solutions. In addition, we like to bring a real entrepreneurial approach to this. So we look for things where we can see ahead a little bit, take action, and just get going on it. So if you could go to the next slide. How we've interfaced, thank you, to life cycle refrigerant management. We like to take the big picture and then narrow down into action. So some of the big picture things we've done is really understanding all the different sources of emissions in relation to HFCs, taking a close look at global warming potential metrics. Where are some of the hotspots? What are some of the particular actions people can take? And then what are the barriers to those actions? So what's holding things back? The other thing we like to do is really get out in the field. Obviously, it was challenging during COVID to do that, but we have since got out and really seen through field work and qualitative research what's actually going on around the world, but really what's happening on the ground. It's important to not just get lost in our graphs and really get into the real practice here. We've engaged a lot of different people, and then we have current work in some of these areas I'm showing here, and I'd just like to emphasize that, we like to find very practical, pragmatic approaches, use all the tools in the toolbox. That could be a carbon market approach, or it could be looking at policy, or it could be actually helping to pilot projects and do some on-the-ground measurement work. And we like to share our results and keep learning. Like, we're still learning. We have a sort of youthful team, and we like to bring people along with this journey. So if you could go to the next slide. So in terms of what companies are doing and why they might actually think about life cycle refrigerant management, some of this is actually from my prior work as a consultant to many companies on their sustainability plans. But obviously you heard a lot about policies and regulations and being in compliance. Everyone, of course, needs to be in compliance, but this is a challenge in and of itself when you're across many jurisdictions, especially for global companies. So just being aware of all the different rules in all the different places can be a full-time job, and it is complex. However, you know, if you're having a good approach to life cycle refrigerant management, thinking about the co-benefits here of energy efficiency, of cost savings, largely through buying less gases if you're reducing leaks or extending the equipment life or just using less energy to run your equipment. They're real cost savings that you can measure and showcase. In addition, many companies have set climate goals themselves voluntarily, as Richie mentioned. And interestingly, life cycle refrigerant management can actually help you on your Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 goals. So Scope 1 obviously is your own emissions, and this could be from leaking equipment. So if you're reducing leaks and having to recharge less, then you're going to be reducing your Scope 1 emissions. Scope 2, because you're using less energy. And Scope 3 is really at the end of life or upstream to reduce the overall gases coming from this equipment into the atmosphere. So dealing with some of these bank issues that Richie described so well. There's all sorts of circular economy opportunities here of managing these really important gases carefully throughout their life cycle and trying to make it a more circular approach so that we're not wasting resources. Many health and safety benefits, we've touched on a couple of them today. When it comes to purchasing, I'll get into this a little bit more, but some of the functions that people are anyway doing within their companies on strategic sourcing or on managing their own assets more carefully or engaging their suppliers can really come to play here and are incredibly important tools for driving LRM and making sure that this is done well and that you're actually measuring and monitoring and reporting on what you're doing. And then generally, one of the drivers for LRM is just sort of this idea that many companies are wanting to be leaders in sustainability, and they're quite competitive with each other, or they'd like to become more so. And so this is actually a really interesting area for them, for many companies, because nearly everyone has some sort of a cooling system, whether they own it and operate it themselves, or if they're in an office space where they're leasing space, they still have quite a lot of interaction with this. So this is one of the few product categories that nearly all companies actually have touch on in some way or another. Okay, so let's just talk about a few corporate examples of some really interesting partnerships that are emerging. If you could go to the next slide, please. So we have here a mix. So this is really just a smattering of examples, and I'll just say it is by no means comprehensive. There are many more examples out there, and we hope even more to come, actually. So this is just the private sector, a few private sector examples. So you see a mix of companies here, some end users of refrigerants like IKEA, and then some equipment manufacturers and OEMs as well. And so in the IKEA example, my understanding is, and this is, you know, just based on research and reading up on what they're doing, I don't have firsthand knowledge of what they're doing, but I thought it was super interesting that they're taking a very global approach to the issue of life cycle refrigerant management. They've been very comprehensive. They've conducted an inventory of all their assets globally. They've set goals. They've tried to centralize their management of refrigerants to a certain extent, at least from a data and asset management point of view. And they're thinking about this sort of portfolio of stores as well as equipment, as well as in their supply chain, cafeterias, food, you know, all the way back, anything that's being cooled that they come in touch with, as well as the products that use refrigerants that they're selling. fridges and that sort of thing. So they're quite comprehensive. And they, after doing that inventory, focused on reducing leaks, first from their Scope 1 emissions. They also then, and they set goals around reducing leaks and making sure that they're doing seals and insulation and so on. They also did a lot of stuff at training. They train technicians. A lot of this comes down to real operations and maintenance when it's in-house to reduce the leaks and whatnot. Also to make sure that equipment was installed correctly to begin with. I mean, there's a lot of things that can be done which are very, it's not the glamorous, big, sort of fancy new equipment, but it actually adds up to way more greenhouse gas savings than I think most people kind of realize. Anyway, I could go on about them, but I think some of the other examples here on the screen, so LG, Air Conditioning Technologies in the US is partnering with one reclaimer, Hudson Technologies, to make lower GWP reclaimed refrigerants available to their customer base. So that's a great example. Similarly, Trane Supply is collaborating with AGAS, offering a refrigerant reclaim program to collect and reclaim used refrigerants from its customers, and partnering then with AGAS, we've heard, is a great program and company to deal with those, and then reclaim it responsibly and resell it back into the market. Daikin is a Japanese company, and actually they're global. So this is just one particular example from Europe that they're using reclaimed R134A in the production of heat pumps and some other chillers in a factory near Rome, and they're hoping to reclaim up to 400,000 kilograms per year of that gas of R134A, which is quite a big number. And then finally on the screen here, we have Lennox, who has recently acquired a recovery company. So we'll wait and see what happens. So just some examples. And what I like about these is that they're showing deep partnership and different aspects of the supply chain. And they're trying to make it easier for their customers to do this. And I would love to see even more of that activity happening. And so that the customers and the users of the refrigerants can really showcase what they're doing here. Can have measurable results that they can show in their ESG reports and really show that they're driving down their emissions through Scope 1, 2, and 3 over time. So if you could go to the final slide that I had prepared, which is just talking about purchases for a minute. So I used to be on the board of and help found the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council. I interacted with a lot of large purchasers, including US federal government through the EPA's program, GSA and others. So I have a little bit of understanding of what purchasers' actions can take. And so this could be for a government agency or a large company or, say, a university, for example. Mike said this well. I think you really first need to understand what your assets are and the emissions associated with them. You can get, paralysis by analysis here, so you can get a little detailed, but at least understand high level where the hotspots are and where you can make an impact. Another step could be looking at upcoming contracts, either for equipment or maintenance or dealing with end of life, and start to bring in those either lower GWP drop into substitutes, reclaim gases, or look at, lower GWP equipment, or zero in some cases. It may even be possible. Make sure that things have automatic, any equipment has automatic leak detection if that's possible. And in some places it's actually going to be required. So get ahead of the law on that one. And then think, purchasing, people often just think about equipment, but in fact, a lot of this goes through service contracts. So you can be thoughtful about the service contracts as well. And I've listed a few actions there. And then finally, just to wrap up, just, this idea of measuring and reporting and sharing results, including, lessons learned along the way. And I think there is a big community of organizations willing and eager to learn about this. I think where even competitors, they're not competing on this topic. So, you know, how we cool our buildings and our food and whatnot, we all can do this more sustainably and responsibly. We can all share what's working, what's not working. And I think this is a very tangible area for climate action. So we're generally excited to be supportive here, and I'd love to hear any questions or comments or ideas on how people can collaborate to make this happen. So back over to you, Zoe. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anastasia. And that was like, I think a perfect tee up. We have a few minutes left before the close of the hour to run through the questions that I was seeing popping up in our chat. Just a reminder for anybody that joined afterwards, there is a little triangle, square, circle in the bottom right-hand corner. If you'd like to pose a question there, just make sure that you identify who the speaker is. So I'm going to actually go ahead and see what we have there and ask, I think there's a few in here that I can see that are for Mike, for you. Perhaps you can probably answer these fairly quickly. There was a very quick question about the chart that you shared about the increased rate of reclaim. If you could please explain what the y-axis was there, and then I think a more in-depth question, if you want to pair it together, of how often would a company like AGAS, so any of the other national reclaimers, sell reclaimed refrigerant with more than 5 or 10% virgin refrigerant in it to keep to that percentage under 15. So I'll let you start with those two.
Yeah, sorry, the y-axis in the graph we showed, and I think that graph will be available. I think this is being taped, so that's years, right? So it's 21 through 24, just to give you a sense of growth. That's what that graph is showing. It's really showing the last 4 years because that's sort of when reclaim for HFC started taking off relative to anticipation of the AIM Act, and then obviously the rollout of the California program was a strong accelerator for growth. So that is years, if that's helpful. The second question, look, it all depends on the company, right? And so if you have a company who has 100 pounds of product at, you know, less than 99.5%, they need to add 100 pounds to bring it up to the grade. You know, they're going to use 50% reclaim. So the answer to that, Michael, really depends on the specific technology of the reclaimer, right? So in our own business, we typically don't find any issue being well under that 15% threshold. It really depends on the product because some of these products are more complicated mixes than others to achieve the purity, to achieve the requirement. Where a gas like 134, which is a single component product, you know, you can darn near do that with 100% reclaim all the time. And that is the backbone of the California 134 small can program, which will be pretty successful. Other products like 404, you might see people putting a bit more virgin in, given the capability they have. But it's a great question. It's a question that you probably want to, you know, ask each individual reclaimer. But I think most of them in the United States should be relatively comfortable for the more popular products, 410 and 134, not having a problem at 15%.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Mike. There is a very hot question in here, which maybe we'll respond afterwards when we send out the presentation of, could anybody help compare the benefits and drawbacks of regulations that require reclaimed refrigerants versus extended producer responsibility? But in the probably 40 seconds and counting, I don't think we can probably dive into that right now. There is one, maybe if people are willing to stay on for a minute or two afterwards, and I'll pose this, Richie, to you and to Anastasia as well, of like, how do we see potential partnerships with community development financial institutions unfolding, given they can provide and disperse funds from the greenhouse gas reduction funds and are specialized in working with small businesses. And I think that's kind of an interesting sort of consideration of that incentive approach, so the carrot approach there. So I don't know, Richie or Anastasia, if you've kind of come across that or have any immediate thoughts of how these other incentive mechanisms can help to overlay and be braided in with some of these other regulations.
I'll quickly respond first just from more a policy standpoint, and then Anastasia is so experienced in talking about other climate financing mechanisms. I'll leave it to her. But really, there are examples of incentive programs now in California. The F-gas reduction incentive program is active now. It's authorized by legislature, and it is currently, for this year, I believe, a $65 million program, which is designed to incentivize the transition to low, ultra-low GWP technologies, but also look at maximizing reclamation and reuse. So I think there's a conversation to be had on how to keep programs like that going and increasing the charter so that more small businesses, as they develop their plans, can access those funds, and then expanding that to other states. So that's that. And then I'll turn it over to Anastasia. And we're out of time, so I'll stop now.
Yeah, I'll just very briefly say I think it's a great idea. I don't actually know of any of them that are doing it. So let's look into it and see what would qualify or not. Why I love this idea, like some of the utility programs, energy efficiency programs, and other kind of existing programs, is that they already have the reach and the relationships with many of these small organizations or even large ones. So you don't have to build that. You can sort of rely on their existing infrastructure and program staff and whatnot to get these funds. But yeah, I'd love to look at it, see what qualifies, guide more funding into this area. I think it's a fantastic idea. So thank you for bringing it up.
Yeah. I always love it when we have questions that help to tee up the closing of how to stay engaged and, like how to get involved and continue this conversation. So, a quick nod, REEF is the platform that is helping to bring together and amplify all of these great conversations, and obviously make sure that we're helping to find answers to some of these questions that you all are asking. So please reach out if you want to jump in, offer your time and expertise to support any REEF initiative, you're interested in partnering with us, or want to dive in more directly and join us and the network of industry leaders that we work with already. This is our contact information. That's a QR code that takes us to our REEF website as well for more information. But with that, thank you again so much to our speakers. Thank you, our audience, for going over a few minutes on time here. This has been an incredibly robust and rich conversation, and I'm really looking forward to welcoming everybody and more individuals back to the next REEF webinar that we'll be hosting in the new year. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.